Okay, in this video we're going to talk about how to convert fractions to decimals to percents. By now you should know how to convert from percents to decimals, from decimals to percents, from fractions to percents, from fractions to decimals, and from decimals to fractions. So all we're doing in this video is just tying it all in. Okay, so we're going to fill out the class notes right quick so we understand how to do this. Alright, so percent. Remember, what does this word mean? Percent. We talked about it in the last video. I told you every single time you see the word percent, you should think of a certain number. Anybody remember what number that is? Percent means, in simple words, out of 100. Remember, that's the number that you always want to remember when you see the word percents. Percent is out of 100. Now, if you want to do the correct mathematical vocabulary, a percent is a ratio that compares a number to 100. That's the actual definition, mathematical. Okay, so if it's out of 100, then we can write our percentages as fractions and then as decimals. Let's get some practice. Here we go. 55%, that just means 55 is being compared to 100. So there's my fraction. And my decimal, it means I'm going to write that fraction in the hundreds place, because that's out of 100. So 55, the last place needs to be filled out, has to be the hundreds place. And that's the second decimal place behind the decimal. So this is my decimal. Now this fraction cannot be left as 55 over 100. I have to reduce it, I have to simplify it. So I'm going to do that by dividing top and bottom, the numerator and the denominator, by 5. If I divide by 5, let's see what I end up with. 100 divided by 5, I know that's 20, because 100 divided by 5 times 20 is 100. And I know that 5 times 11 is 55. So my fraction, my final answer for the fraction, has to be this one right here. 11 out of 20. 11 20ths. Okay? And I can't simplify anymore, because 11 is a prime number, so I cannot reduce anymore. Now 70% and 88% is the same thing we just did. 70% means 70, let's try green, 70 out of 100. And for my decimal place, well, that's just 70 in the hundredths place, because the hundredths place has to be filled in because we're talking about out of 100. So I'm going to put the 0 right here for 70 and the 7 right there. 70 hundredths. Now that sounds a little funny, right? Well, that's because we don't need this 0 right here. We can just say 0.7. Now, if you say 0.7, you're not saying it right. You need to say 7. And what's that place value right there? Oh yeah, that's the tenths place. So this is read as 7 tenths. That's the name of that decimal right there. Okay. Now, why is this fraction 70 over 100 and this is 7 tenths? Well, remember what we did in the previous fraction? We simplified. And because both of these 70 and 100 end in a 0, I know that I can take 10 out of each one. I can divide by 10. So what I'm going to do is 70 divided by 10. It's going to be 7. Because 7 times 10 is 70. And 10 times 10 is 100. So 100 divided by 10 is 10. And now I have 7 tenths. And that's my answer for my fraction. Same thing as my decimal. Okay, 88%, not bad. 88 out of 100. So my decimal place would be, let's see, let me erase that right quick. Okay, so in my hundredths place, my last number needs to be an 8 for the 88. And I can fill in a 0 right here. So that's my decimal. And now my fraction needs to be reduced. I can reduce this by 2, because they're both even numbers. But if I do that, I'm going to have to reduce again by 2. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce by 4, because I know that 4 goes into both of those numbers, 88 and 100, evenly. Okay, here's what I get. I know that 4 times 25, okay, is 100. So 88 divided by 4 gives me 22. If you don't believe me, go ahead and do your division this way. Okay, 4 goes into 8 twice. That's 8, remainder 0. Bring down the 8. 4 goes into 8 twice. 4 times 2 is 8, remainder 0. So 88 divided by 4 is 22, which is what I have right here. And I'm done. Okay, 22 is not a prime number. It can be divided by 1 and itself, and 11 and 2. But none of those numbers divide 25. Because 25 is only divisible by 1 and 25 and 5. So you cannot divide anymore. Okay, I'm going to scroll down so we can go to the next problems. And we have 5%, 7.2, and 0.1. I do want to talk about this next one. I'm not going to do 5% with you. You can do that one on your own. But 7.2, I want to talk to you about that one. Because it's 7.2, right? Percent. Well, that looks a little weird when you put it in a fraction. 7.2 out of 100. Well, I don't want to move it out of 100. I want to move this decimal over to the right. The only way I can do that is if I multiply 7.2 times 10. 0 times 2 is 0. 0 times 7 is 0. 1 times 2 is 2. 1 times 7 is 7. And when I add them up, I end up with, whoops, 720. But since I have one decimal place in my problem, I need to have one decimal place in my answer. So that's how I get to 72. 72 whole numbers. If I multiply by 10. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to multiply the top times 10 and the bottom times 10. That's going to give me an equivalent fraction of 72 on the top. And here's the mathematics that goes with that. 72, 10 times 0.72 is 72. And 100 times 10, well, that's just 100 with a 0 behind it. That's 1,000. So there's my fraction. And to write it as a decimal, this is why I want to write it as a whole number on the top. By the way, that's why we're multiplying by 10 right here. Because if I have a whole number on the top, not a decimal, but a whole number, I can use my place value to write my decimal. For example, this is over 1,000. So my place value after the decimal is the tenths, then the hundredths, then the thousands. That means that the last number right here has to be that 2. So that it can be 72 thousandths. And that means I have to have a 0 right here. So that's my decimal, that's my fraction. Now this is not simplified. If you think about it, 72 out of 1,000, you can divide this by 2, at least by 2, because both of them are even numbers. And if you divide by 2, I know 1,000 divided by 2, well, that's half of 1,000 is 500. And 72 divided by 2 is going to give me 36. Now they're still even numbers, so I can divide by 2 again. 36 divided by 2, that's 18. And half of 500, that's 250. They're still even numbers, so I can divide by 2 again. I know it seems like a lot of work, but this is the last step. 2 goes into 18 9 times. 2 times 9 is 18. And 250 divided by 2 is 125. So I can move this out of the way. And I can write that a little bit better for y'all. 125. So there's my fraction for 7.2%. I know that's a lot of work, and that, I gave you just a little bit of space in these notes. But you can always write all this work on a separate sheet of paper and just staple it to your notes. That way you know where all this information is coming from. And in your notes, you can just write down the fraction right here in the middle, so that it can be with all your fractions. And your decimal is sitting right here for you to copy down into your notes. Okay, same thing for the next one. Let me clear my screen here. Same thing for the next one, 0.1%. That means 0.1 out of 100. If I want to write it down as a decimal over here, I need to make sure that I get rid of that decimal on top. The only way I can do that is if I multiply the top times 10. That way that decimal moves over one space to the right, and if I multiply this times 10, I end up with 1,000 on the bottom, and 1 times 10 gives me 1. Whoops, not 10. Gives me 1. So it's just 1 over 1,000. That's 1,000th with a TH at the end. So my decimal place value, nothing in the tenths place, nothing in the hundredths place, but I need a 1 in the thousandths place. So you can fill in a couple of zeros right there, and you have your decimal place value. Okay? Let's see. Okay, now we're going to go to the bottom part of this notes, and then we'll be done because you're going to do by yourself the back side. This side right here, on the other side of your notes, you get to practice how to change a percent to a fraction and reduce it to lowest terms. Okay, and this is how you change a fraction to a percent, by changing it first to a decimal or making it bottom be at 100. This one's easy to make it a bottom 100 because you just got to multiply by 4, the top and the bottom, and you get a 100 at the bottom. You get whatever number you get in the top, that's going to be your percent. But for a decimal, remember that word TIBO, top in, bottom out. If you need to go review the other video on how to change a fraction to decimal, then you may do that at this time. That's the first fraction, the first video that we watched that you were supposed to watch over the Labor Day weekend. But okay, let's look at these real quick. Decimal to fraction. Again, to go from decimal to a fraction, just read it correctly. That's not 0.06. So get rid of that way of writing it. It's not 0.06 or reading it. It's 6 hundredths. That's in the hundredths place. So my fraction is 6 over 100. My percent is 6%. 41 hundredths. That's 41 out of 100. That's 41%. 8. That's not hundredths. That's 8 tenths. Again, you can fill in a 0 right here if you want to in the hundredths place and write it as 80 over 100. That's 80 hundredths. That's the easy way of doing it. The other way of doing it, if you really write it as 8 tenths, remember, all you got to do is multiply the top times 10 and the bottom times 10. That will get you your 100 here at the bottom that you need. And then over here on the top, you get your 80. And that gives you the decimal that you want, the percent that you want. 80 out of 100 is 80%. What happens when you have a 1 in the ones place after the decimal, to the left of the decimal? Well, that's going to be a whole number. Okay, so it's going to be 1 and 5 hundredths. So 5 out of 100. Okay, and my percent is going to be 1 and 5 hundredths, so that's 5%, right? So that would be 105. So this 1 is kind of like saying 100%. So if you have 100%, that's where the 100 comes from, and then 5 out of 100, that's 5%. So 100% and 5. If you add those two together, you end up with 105%. Okay, this is 55 thousandths. So it's 55 out of 1,000. And this is 6 and 5 tenths. So 6 and 5 tenths.